Hi, everyone. This is Roman History. I'm Dr. Young. Today, we're going to be talking about the third century crisis. This is a period of time that is chaotic. It has been dealt with by different historians, mostly unkindly over many centuries. And that's the first point here. The historiography of the third century is heavily biased against it. Both late antique authors, in other words, 4th and 5th and 6th century authors, and eventually the authors of, say, the Renaissance period of the 16th century, saw this as a time when everything that was good about Rome came apart, was lost, and even though there was a kind of rejuvenation, that rejuvenation happened on terms that were different and decidedly less favorable to the overall well-being of Western civilization. I'm sort of obviously portraying some of the bias here of these historians. Even late antique authors either judge this period on one of two reasons. Either, like Ammianus Marcellinus, they were pagan in a world that was becoming increasingly Christian, and thus he sort of looked back at this period as the thing that messed up everything for Rome, abandoning its traditional religion and all of that. Or seen from the viewpoint of Christian historians of late antiquity, this period was a time of great persecution, even though those persecutions were actually quite sporadic and tied to the reigns of specific emperors. And so, this whole notion of crisis, I think, is an accurate one, but it's one that is just incredibly biased by the historiography. And maybe if we take a little closer look at it, we can nuance some of that, the notion of chaos and crisis here. What were the factors in the crisis? Well, there were many of them. There were frequent military mutinies in this period, especially in the 50 years between 235 and 284, I guess, when Diocletian became emperor. The military made emperors and removed emperors, and sometimes the same soldiers who made emperors, in other words, elevated their commanders to the position of emperors, would then turn against that same former commander, now emperor, and murder him, assassinate him, or join up with some rival of his and overthrow him militarily, right? So the military becomes increasingly important in this period. We might say that all of the power pretty much is held in the hands of the military, with a little bit functioning in the hands of the Praetorian prefects. The senators become increasingly marginalized and even irrelevant, we might say, during this period. There's also an economic crisis that goes into this. This isn't just political. This isn't just a bunch of emperors being assassinated or overthrown by soldiers, though there was certainly a lot of that. It was also an economic crisis. Periodically, the Roman emperors, largely because they were deeply indebted to their soldiers who elevated them to the throne, devalued the currency, that is, debased it, produced coins that had much smaller content of precious metals in them, which tends to increase prices. This makes it hard on the common people who, see the prices of things like grain and olive oil and the other staples of life go up. And so, this produces a great deal of discontent. Moreover, the Roman state continued to make serious demands on people. In fact, we would say accurately that they increased the number of demands. Higher taxes or new taxes. Romans, people in the empire, were being taxed in ways that they had never been taxed before. Now, there were emperors who tried to offset these negative developments by doing things like extending citizenship to more and more people, but that became less and less meaningful as people were paying higher taxes, and the perks of being a citizen were far less than they had once been. Right, so the state demands were felt all over the empire, and by people from all sectors of society. This was no longer a democracy of the wealthy and the honorable doing all of the work for everybody else. I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because, of course, that was never really the case. But even the elites, to some extent, see their power wane, become marginalized, and power is in the hands of mostly the military. And the rest of the empire came to support the military monetarily and via taxes in kind and things like this. Now, one of the areas in which the historiography is most biased, of course, is in the area of religion in this period. Christianity became increasingly popular, as did a number of other cults. This is the period when the cults of, for instance, Elagabalus, who's a Middle Eastern sun god, or later on the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which is more of a Mediterranean phenomenon. Both of those, and to some extent Elagabalus and Sol Invictus, and for that matter Jesus, were conflated at times by different figures. But one thing is certain, and that is that things were changing religiously in this period, and that may be partly, or perhaps even largely, a response to the uncertainties of life in the empire, the constantly increasing taxes, the greater demands that the Roman Empire was placing on people, the instability of the political system, the constant warring between Roman armies and against foreign rivals. All of these things really destabilized life, right? So people tended to turn to mystery cult figures or to, the cult of Jesus, or these or other kind of Middle Eastern religious forms, and this, caused some discontent. Now, there were, of course, some of this dissent, we might say, was started at the top. Emperors introduced some of these things from time to time into Roman life, even kind of foisted them on the empire. The Severan Emperor Avitus, for instance, otherwise known as Elagabalus, when he became emperor, was already a priest in the cult of Elagabalus. Later on, there were a couple of emperors who embraced Christianity to one extent or another, right? So the emperors were at times friendly to these new religious forms, and other times they persecuted them. So there's a sort of back and forth movement to all of that. And that, is another destabilizing factor, we might say. Now, later historians, especially into the Enlightenment period, which didn't see a rejection of all religion, but certainly framed religion differently in historical terms than had been previously the case. So, for instance, Edward Gibbon is maybe the best example here. They saw the rise of Christianity as this takeover by a Middle Eastern mystical cult of the previously logical, philosophy, reason-based empire. Now, that depiction, of course, is pretty ahistorical if you really look at. It says far more about. If you really look at the sources from this period and look at the circumstances, it says much more about Gibbon, I think, that he believed that, than it does about 3rd and 4th century Rome. There's also a great deal of foreign pressure on Rome in this period. It could not happen at a worse time. That there's a newly ascendant and quite powerful, successful Persian Empire under a dynasty called the Sassanids, beginning in the middle of the 3rd century, and the Sassanids from time to time attacked Rome, took over some of its territory, for instance, sacked the city of Antioch. It's kind of a wonder that the Sassanids didn't press their claims further. They tended to raid into Roman territory and then withdraw, rather than try to maintain their hold on that territory. Maybe they were learning from the experience of the Romans in Mesopotamia, who, once they conquered Mesopotamia a couple of different times, first under Trajan and then under Septimius Severus, they never were able to maintain any kind of stable government there, and perhaps the Sassanids didn't want to conquer into Anatolia or conquer the Levant, and then have the problem. Sorry for the yawn. Have the problem of trying to rule that territory thereafter. The other area that exerted pressure from outside of the empire on Rome was the territory known by the Romans as Germania, the Germans. Now, the Germans are a very misunderstood group of people in this ancient period. Even Thomas Africa, I think, errs several times on the side of biased ancient historical texts like Tacitus to depict these people as bloodthirsty barbarians. Africa in the textbook even says, I think, that they were just interested in pillaging and plundering and raping wherever they could, right? Truthfully, the Germans, although they did have a warrior culture, and there's no question about that, and this warrior ethos at times inspired them to invade surrounding territories, either against other Germans or, if the Romans were vulnerable, to invade Rome, right? In the 3rd century, for instance, Germanic chieftains waged attacks on staged attacks, naval attacks on the Black Sea region, and even though they didn't take over that region, they did destabilize it and do some plundering there. After that, they attacked a number of cities in Greece, including places like Athens, and took away, mostly just raided and took away booty from there. Though the Germans did begin to establish a permanent presence in parts of Rome. And it was also in this period, it should be said, that the emperors began I think the rather ingenious tactic of recruiting Germans into the Roman army. And this was good for Rome. Arguably, it's one of the things that enabled Rome to continue to survive after this whole period of crisis. It was good for Rome in a couple different respects. For one, Rome had a difficult time by this point recruiting soldiers into the army. It was a long commitment. This is a period that witnesses a number of military reforms that are essential and a step in the right direction, especially under the reigns of emperors like Aurelian or Gallienus and Aurelian later in the 3rd century. But the emperors of the 3rd century were successful at doing this, and this really gave the military new life. Now, of course, it did begin to change the ethnic character of it, which would cause some problems later on. And it's really, the Germans in the Roman army who decide eventually by the late 4th century that they don't really need Romans around to lead troops, right? That the troops are loyal to them, and this causes some serious destabilization later on. So that's something we'll get to in a future class. Okay, so this is a list of a number of things, and it's not an exhaustive list, I should say. It gives us some indication of this. Now, I don't want to go kind of step by step through every single emperor, talk about every detail here. Because most of these emperors they don't reign very long. They tended to be assassinated after a year or two of their rule. And so in the longer term scheme of things, I think it's more important to just establish the atmosphere here and some of the things that were going on, some of the rules of the game, so to speak. All right, so let's go through a few emperors, and then we'll give some concluding details here. In the year 193, when Commodus was assassinated, there was a struggle for the throne. There were a couple of different senators who competed with each other over this. I don't want to go too much into the details. In a way, the Senate overplayed its hand, and the military ended up intervening, specifically the legions under the command of a guy named Septimius Severus. And Severus was the one who founded a new dynasty. He himself had a fairly lengthy rule of 18 years, with successors ruling for another 17 years. No, let's see, another 24 years. And so, in the broader scheme of things, this is one of the longer-lived dynasties, longer than the Flavian dynasty, for instance. But it was almost entirely a military-based dynasty. These were generals, and they spent most of their time with their troops, gave all the privileges that they were willing to hand out to their troops, and really kind of marginalized all other groups in Rome. And so this is the beginning of this trend, right, of military dominance. Septimius Severus had some success as emperor. He was an emperor of, we have to give him credit, of some renown, right? So, for instance, in a few years into his reign, in the late 190s, he invaded Mesopotamia, and even went on to sack the city of Ctesiphon, which was the Parthian capital. The Parthian, of course, the dynasty that had ruled over Persia since the 2nd century BCE by this point. So it's, this is a long-lived empire. But the Parthians were really, really weak. And this is under a dynasty called the Arsacids. And this dynasty was really kind of in its last gasp. And Severus, unwittingly, in this invasion of Mesopotamia, ended up sort of tipping the balance against the Arsacids. They were shortly after this overthrown by a new dynasty called the Sassanids. And we'll have more to say about the Sassanids later, but they become much more of a threat to Rome than the Arsacid-run Parthian Empire ever had been, at least for the previous couple of centuries. And so, this Roman meddling may have hurt the empire in the long run, given that this helped to produce a new and very successful, very powerful dynasty in Persia. Now, there are some important changes that happen in the Severan period, and these things were already to some extent underway in the 2nd century during the reign of the Antonine emperors. For one, the Senate became increasingly irrelevant. As I said, more and more decision-making power was put in the hands of military leaders. The Severans didn't necessarily like to work with the senators, and they favored equites, whom they raised to higher status. And then they also, as I said, gave a lot of favors to their fellow military commanders. And so we see emerging by the early 3rd century this new division of Roman society, these new terms for people. They started to use these. The terms honestiores and humiliores. Honestiores mean people essentially with honor or with some prestige, and also with some legal privilege. The senators, the equites, to some extent, the gentry in the provinces fits into this category, and certainly the leaders of the military. These are all the honestiores. So the old distinctions, and for that matter, the old concept of honor, except insofar as it meant, association with the emperor, those things were pretty much done away with. So there are no patricians and plebeians anymore. Those traditional kind of distinctions are now gone, and instead we have this group called the honestiores, and then everyone else is part of the humiliores, the mass of the population, right? Who didn't have many legal rights and really experienced nothing we would call privilege, and became increasingly subject to higher taxes. And we could say that the Severans sort of cannibalized the mass of the population to feed the army in imposing these higher taxes and things like that. Severus relied through much of his reign on a couple of Praetorian prefects. The first of these was a guy named Plautianus, and he was given tremendous power within the empire of Septimius Severus. He placed a lot of the decision-making ability for Rome into his hands, as Severus for himself was spent much of his time with the military on campaign. But it was obvious that Plautianus wanted to not necessarily overthrow overthrow his friend Septimius Severus, but at least insert himself and his family more and more into the affairs of the empire. He married his daughter, for instance, to the son of Severus, Caracalla, and tried to kind of elevate her position, and all with the goal in mind, of course, of her producing an heir and his family eventually rising to the throne. Now, a few years after all of this happened, by the way, Caracalla did not like his wife very much. They didn't get along. But Caracalla eventually, who also hated his father-in-law, he convinced Septimius Severus that Plautianus was rebellious, that he was out for the throne, and so Severus eventually, probably somewhat reluctantly, had his friend executed. And there was another Praetorian prefect, Papinian, who succeeded after this, though he dies shortly into the reign of the next emperor, which is the son of Septimius Severus. The other powerful figure in this reign and in the following, in the years after Septimius Severus, was his wife, Julia Domna. Now, there's going to be 3 Julias here, all of them, powerful dowager empresses. Julia Domna was from Syria, and Severus himself was from North Africa, and this underscores a trend here, that the Severan emperors began to give privileges to the elites in places like Syria and North Africa, to the point that many of these emperors in the 3rd century hail from one of these provincial places that had previously been kind of backwaters of the empire, or at least not part of the privileged lands of the empire. Now, when Severus was getting near death, he died on a military campaign trying to invade Scotland. If you're hearing noise in the background, I'm actually filming this in Istanbul, and the call to prayer is happening outside, so hopefully I can compete with, there are about 3 or 4 mosques in this neighborhood, and the loudspeakers are quite overwhelming. It's really cool to hear, but hopefully I can compete with that, and it doesn't, kind of interrupt what's going on. In any case, when Severus was setting up his son as his heir, he actually 2 sons, Caracalla and his younger brother Geta. He encouraged them to get along and to share rule, and he probably figured that his wife, who was quite a bit younger than him and survived much longer than he did, a few years at least longer than he did, that she would hold a special place in the new empire under his sons, that she would somehow keep them together. That was not going to happen, though, because the older son, Caracalla, was not thrilled about this arrangement. He did not want to share rule with his brother. In fact, the 2 brothers seemed to have loathed each other. So Caracalla, shortly after that they became joint emperors, Caracalla arranged for his brother to be assassinated, and the Praetorian prefect, who had opposed this decision, Papinian, the previous, he was the Praetorian prefect under Septimius Severus as well. He was also executed, and so Caracalla had a somewhat inauspicious beginning to his reign, and it truthfully didn't get much better after that. Now, there are a couple of things of note in the reign of Caracalla, otherwise we might just kind of gloss over him here. One is that he built these baths in Rome that dwarfed in size any baths that had come before this, I'll come back to this point. Those are the points in a minute. These are the ruins of the Baths of Caracalla, and it's hard to get a sense of scale here, okay, but this is an absolutely massive structure. Here is a map of this building. You can see that the Baths of Caracalla had multiple pools. I mean, the Roman bathhouses, of course, there were three major bathing areas. The hot room, or caldarium, was this part. The tepidarium, or the warm room, was here. This is where they would go after they had, scraped the olive oil and dirt and things like that off of their skin. In the hot room, in the kind of steam room, they would go here, dip themselves, but then they would spend most of their time, one of these is kind of a recreational pool. The other one was the frigidarium, which is the place to go and relax in the water. I think I showed this in an earlier class, actually, but they had workout facilities, one for men, one for women, lots of other rooms, changing rooms and things like this, right? So huge building, and with a, grounds, kind of gardens surrounding the bath to match. This could, fit hundreds, if not thousands, of bathers at a single time. So imagine, the biggest kind of resort pool thing that you can think of. And of course, being from many of you from Florida, you probably have visited some of the resorts, the Disney resorts or something like this. So you may get a sense of what the Baths of Caracalla were like. Anyway, so that's one thing of note that happened under the reign of Caracalla. He ordered the building of these baths, but at the same time, his father had actually managed finances fairly effectively, and he had a surplus in the treasury and things like this. Even though he may have done some debasing of the currency, Caracalla went all in for the debasing of the currency. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, Rome had minted coins with precious metals in them, either silver or gold. There were times when, they would strike new coins or try to peg the currency to some specific coin, usually a gold-based coin of some sort, where Caracalla did away with a lot of that, and he sort of ordered the gathering of all of the existing coins, and then minted new coins that had much less precious metal content to them. This increased the inflation. He was able. Now, this is the short-term advantage of this is that he had more money, and thus could pay soldiers, which is what he did with it. The army was demanding more and more from him, and he increased their pay, and he needed to pay more soldiers because he was involved in military campaigns. He had planned one. He actually staged some successful campaigns on the German frontier, but then planned an invasion of Mesopotamia, trying to follow in the footsteps of his father. Caracalla styled himself actually after Alexander the Great. He was fascinated by him. He didn't resemble him in much other than having, reign over an empire. Caracalla himself was a rather short, kind of nondescript fellow. But in any case, this did not earn him much popularity in the East. When he went to Alexandria as part of one of these, trying to whip up support for his Eastern campaign, the Alexandrians actually mocked him, and he ordered that his troops then attack people in the city. Okay, so this did not endear him to people in the East, and may have contributed to his eventual assassination. At the same time, and this is an indication of the growing weakness of the emperors, in the year 212, only a year after Caracalla became emperor, and shortly after he had his brother and Papinian, the Praetorian prefect, executed, he issued a blanket grant of citizenship to all all men in the empire, except those who went by the title Dedicii. That's a complicated Latin term. It means something like conquered peoples or refugees or something like that. In other words, Caracalla left in the hands of his officials the distinction of who got to be citizens or not. But most men did become citizens. But it didn't mean much by this point because the Severans were, so busy increasing taxes and taking away privileges from citizens that making more people citizens didn't necessarily provide any great advantage to all of those people. And there's something about granting it to millions of people who hadn't previously had it that waters down the very distinction of being a citizen, right? Whereas before, it had been really kind of a select group in the empire. Now, as I said, he was assassinated on the Parthian border. The Praetorian prefect Macrinus probably was the one who orchestrated this assassination, and Macrinus then became the emperor. He was not a senator. He was not necessarily associated with the military. And in fact, he had little support from the military, which is one of the things that made his reign so short. And so, all the support he really had was from the, from the Praetorian Guard. Julia Maesa, who was the sister of Julia Domna. So Julia Domna died right around the time Caracalla did. It seems that she had breast cancer. But Julia Maesa moved quickly against Macrinus and claimed that her son, whose name was Avitus, was actually the bastard child of Caracalla. Now, that would mean that there was some incest happening there, by the way. Caracalla would have had to produce this child, I got to think, with his niece, I guess. His niece or his cousin, anyway. I guess it would have been his niece. But, whatever the case was, Avitus had the support of the legions because Macrinus didn't do much to foster a relationship with the military. And so this arrangement by Julia Maesa, and this involved a lot of bribery. The Severans, of course, had a lot of money, and so Julia Maesa was able to pay a lot of people off. And the Senate as well sort of cowed to her demands, especially after she bribed some of the key senators. And so Avitus, who was only 15 years old, became the next emperor. Now, Avitus, that's his actual name, but he went by another name, which was Elagabalus. Elagabal was a sun god from the Middle East, from a place called Emesa, and in Syria, where the whole family was from. At least the empress side of the family, Julia Domna and Julia Maesa, had come from that area. His mother was named Soaemias, and she didn't necessarily get along with her sister, whose name, and this is a third Julia, was Julia Mamea. And that's going to cause some problems later on. But Elagabalus, which is, again, his preferred name, after the god he worshipped, he was also a priest of this deity. Now, Thomas Africa definitely does not like Elagabalus. He called him, and I'm quoting here, a mincing, rouged, bejeweled transvestite, as if that somehow disqualified him from being a good emperor. But Elagabalus definitely was the subject of a kind of smear campaign by historians who really didn't like him later on. In any case, this reign of Elagabalus produced a rivalry between his mother Soaemias and her sister Julia Mamea. These are the daughters of Julia Maesa. And to try to sort all of that out, Julia Maesa intervened against the protestations of Soaemias and had Elagabalus, who never married and In fact, I think he died when he was 19 years old. He was forced to adopt his cousin as his heir. His cousin's name was Severus Alexander. Okay, and so the when so Ammias learned about this turn of events. Julia Mesa had done this without consulting with her daughter. When Ammias learned about this, she decided, or she tried to bribe people to have Severus Alexander and her sister, Julia Mamaea, killed. But Julia Mesa, who was now sort of disenchanted with Ammias, arranged for the Praetorian Guards to murder Elagabalus, to murder her own grandson and her daughter, for that matter. Okay, and so Severus Alexander became emperor. Now, I mean, we're talking about this like this is normal. Okay, this is obviously not normal. So things have already gotten pretty bad here. That these dowager empresses were quite powerful and were making life and death decisions about their own family members here to maintain the family's hold on the throne. And I mean, on the one hand, we do have really good examples of powerful women exerting tremendous power in this period, but on the other hand, these women were making decisions that were decidedly, at least by our standards, unethical here, right? Having their own children or their own grandchildren killed. Now, Julia Mesa dies shortly after this, and Julia Mamaea, the mother of Severus Alexander, is the real power behind the throne. So we've had now 3 successive dowager empresses, Julia Domna, Julia Mesa, and now Julia Mamaea, who really were more powerful than their sons, who actually reigned as emperors. Right. A couple of things about the reign of Alexander, Severus Alexander. He, like his mother, was an adherent to. I mean, they're from Syria. They're from the east. He had become enamored of several gods from the Eastern Mediterranean or from the Near East. One of these, and so he built a sort of shrine or set of shrines inside of his palace. One of these was to Orpheus, the mythological figure of mysticism and music and things like this. Okay, a divine figure by this point. Abraham, of course, the founder of the Jewish religion. Jesus, and another deity or another kind of mythological figure, Apollonius of Tyana. And this makes sense only if we consider that these people aren't from Rome; they're from the East. These religions were much more popular in the East. There was a fuller and richer kind of religious life there, and this makes sense in that respect. Now, the thing that does even though Severus Alexander was a thoughtful young man, Julia Mamaea was quite adept at wielding power. The place where they failed and ultimately their undoing came from the fact that they created rivals within the army. So this shows the role that the military was playing by this point. Even though Alexander's did wage some successful campaigns into Mesopotamia, fought successfully against the Sassanids, who had newly come to rule in Persia. The army was still discontented, especially when Julia Mamaea and Alexander went to the north and brokered a peace deal with the German groups on the northern frontier, against whom the Romans were fighting at this point. And the generals were not thrilled about this. They wanted to go on military campaign. They wanted, the kind of honor and wealth and things that would come from further conquest. And so while mother and son were still in the north, right along the Rhine River, near what became the city of Mainz, they were assassinated by their soldiers. And this was the end of the Severan dynasty. And it's at this point that things really began to break down. Part of this is due to the increased stature of the Sassanid dynasty. Now, we want to pick this up at least a little bit. The figure who overthrew the Arsacids and founded the Sassanid dynasty was a Persian emperor named Ardashir. He was from a noble family in Persia, a family that already had a great deal of prestige, but when the Arsacids, proved to be quite weak at the end, this family decided they could make a play for the throne. Ardashir did this successfully. After him came his son Shapur I, who ended up being arguably the most successful and most important ruler in the whole period of the Sassanid dynasty, which extended until the 7th century. So Shapur is important. Now, we're not going to say much about the Sassanids because it's a class on Roman history, other than to say that, they did wage some successful campaigns into Roman territory. Most significantly in the year 260, as the Emperor Valerian went to the east to try to stem the tide of one of these invasions. Valerian's troops were defeated, and Valerian himself was captured by Shapur. And poor Valerian, for the rest of his life, he was never recaptured, or what am I trying to say here? He was never won back either through ransom or through military campaign. Valerian spent the rest of his life at the court of the Sassanids. He is the subject of this giant relief statue carved into a cliff face in Persia, or in Iran. This is poor Valerian over here, kind of kowtowing or bending the knee, and Shapur, who I guess this would be a Zoroastrian symbol of some kind, probably. Zoroastrians had a lot of religious rituals that involved fire and the sun and things like this, so I suppose that's what that means. But Shapur is standing above him, and in fact, by some accounts, Valerian became not just the kind of lackey of Valerian, but even was humiliated repeatedly by him, was used as a footstool, was used as a kind of mounting block. Shapur would demand that Valerian came and knelt down so that he could climb on his back and use him as a means to climb on his horse. These are all stories that we can't necessarily verify, but and moreover, some of these stories were passed on, including the story that Valerian was eventually executed by Shapur, and that his body was stuffed with straw, and he was hung from one of the walls or gates or something of one of the cities of the Sassanids. These are probably fantasies of Christian authors who hated Valerian because he had overseen some serious large-scale persecutions of Christians. The Sassanids themselves were committed Zoroastrians. Now, the religion of Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, dated back to a few centuries before Christ, but it had gone through kind of several phases of development. The Sassanids were important to this development. They were religious reformers. So for one, the Zoroastrians did not have a kind of canonical, religiously authoritative text like the Jews and Christians did, although the Christians arguably by this point don't really have one either, other than they were using the Hebrew Bible for some of their scripture. But the Sassanids ordered the collection and kind of canonization, codification of several Zoroastrian texts, and they wrote this anyway. These were all written down, and the text became known as the Avesta, which is, something quite interesting to read. This is, Zoroastrianism is mostly gone. There are, I think, a few adherents in the Middle East, but the Avesta is evidence of the vitality and the kind of scriptural tradition of that tradition, of that religion. Okay. Another key to the success, in addition to sort of unifying the empire under the banner of this reformed Zoroastrianism, And I mean, maybe I should say something about Zoroastrianism, although I guess it's not relevant to this class. But this religion is, by this point at least, was dualist. It had the belief that there was a good God who was spiritual, non-corporeal. His name was Ahura Mazda or Ormazd, depending on the transliteration of that. And then there was also a bad god, an evil god named Akraman, who had created the world and physical bodies and things like this, and that this life was a sort of struggle to transcend the physical and the corporeal, and to believe in Ahura Mazda and do things to serve him and reject Akraman. And so, that religion, or that idea of dual gods, two gods, one good, one bad, is something that had resonance later on in Western civilization. In late antiquity, we're going to see the rise of the Manichaeans, who believed in a sort of dualist cosmological system. And then in the Middle Ages, we have, for instance, the Cathars or the Albigensians, and also the Bogomils in the Eastern Roman Empire, who were also dualists. Now, questions of transmission of these ideas are unanswered or heavily debated, but it's obvious that this whole notion of dualism emerged from ancient Zoroastrianism. Final point about the Sassanids: they, given their location between places like China and India and the Roman Empire, they exerted a lot of dominance over the trade routes and profited tremendously by this. Roman merchants had long been reaching out. At times, Roman merchants may have even gone as far as India, but they had relied on these kind of middlemen in the Near East for these goods. And this is something the Sassanids were able to do successfully, is sort of have a corner on the market in the trade of these luxury goods that were in high demand in the Roman Empire. Things like Chinese silks and Indian spices and other things like that. So this was a key to their success. Definitely, the wealth that came from dominating those trade routes with their cities. Now, most people, like in the Roman Empire, most people in the Sassanid Empire were also peasants who farmed and grew the food that sustained the entire empire. But the cities were places of a lot of trade and economic prosperity. Now, last point here. The period between 235 and 284, so between the reign of Severus Alexander and the reign of Diocletian, in other words, is known as the period of the barracks emperors. Barracks because they spent pretty much all of their time in the barracks with their military. They rarely left the military. There are different reckonings for how many emperors were crowned during this time. It's either 19 or 20 or 26, or depending on, if we count all of the commanders who at one time or another were elevated to the position of emperor by their own legions, or whose legions proclaim them to be the legitimate emperor, we may get closer to 50. Now, I'm not going to go through all 19 or 20 or 26 or 50. I'm simply going to say this is a time of tremendous instability. It's also, interestingly, a time when there were a few really good emperors, but they faced such strong headwinds, so many unstable parts of the system, we might say. I'm mixing metaphors here, but hey, it's late where I am. So rulers like Gallienus and Aurelian were really very effective. Had Gallienus ruled right after Augustus Caesar, or maybe in the 2nd century, we would celebrate him in history as one of the greatest emperors in the history of Rome, probably, and perhaps the same with Aurelian. Some of the things that they did to try to stabilize the empire were nothing short of genius. But, there were soldiers, of course, who were ambitious to try to claim the throne, or rather generals, and and the military was largely up for grabs with whoever bribed or paid the most to soldiers, and so both Gallienus and Aurelian ended up being assassinated by troops, and thus came to an end what otherwise was a fairly effective rule. More typical, I think, were the various failures of Valerian. He, of course, was the guy who was captured by Shapur and became his personal kind of foot slave or footman. Valerian, during his reign, persecuted Christians. This was one of the largest scale persecutions, at least before the reign of Diocletian, maybe the biggest, most systematic persecution of Christians. This is one of the reasons why the historiography is especially unfriendly to Valerian, and tells stories like his body being stuffed with straw and he being hung from the gates of, one of the cities there, right? Or I guess it was a temple of the Magi, the Zoroastrian clergy. But this, and he wasn't the only one, actually. Decius, who had reigned just before him, also persecuted Christians or didn't like them. But there were other emperors who were very friendly to Christianity. Philip the Arab, called so because he was from the province of Arabia Petraea. It's a little bit, and Africa pointed out in the textbook, that it's a little bit ironic that the millennium celebration of the founding of Rome, so Rome is, of course, legendarily founded April 21st, 753 BCE, and so the millennium anniversary of that would have been April 21st, 247 CE. And the Romans knew this, and they celebrated that 1,000 years, but the celebrations took place under the auspices of Emperor Philip, who had been born in Arabia Petraea, had little to do with the foundations of Rome, the old collection of villages there that came together, the identities of Romulus and Remus or anything like that. This just goes to show how far Rome had come from that point, and to some extent how diffuse the notion of being a Roman had become as well. Not to say that he didn't deserve to be emperor or anything like that because he came from one of the provinces. It's just to say that Rome had definitely changed tremendously in 1,000 years. But I suppose that's so for probably any place except maybe pharaonic Egypt. Another point of note here is that as the Romans were fighting constantly against the Sassanids, they first allied with the city-state of Palmyra. The bottom image here is of Palmyra. Actually, I think that this is no longer there now because ISIS, the Islamic State, who ruled over parts of Syria and Iraq, controlled Palmyra, or that territory, for a time, and from reports that I've seen, they ended up dynamiting most of these ruins. So this is part of the efforts of ISIS to kind of deface the past and put to death anything that was not strictly Muslim, right? But I suppose we have pictures, and hopefully people will go there and try to restore some of what has been lost. Same thing happened with a lot of the Assyrian ruins in the area around Mosul in Iraq, and things like this. So anyway, Palmyra was a close ally of Rome, and during the reign of Valerian, and then later under the reign of Gallienus. Gallienus was actually the son of Valerian, and so we go from a fairly ineffective emperor to a quite effective emperor, one of the most effective emperors, definitely of this period. But there was the leader of Palmyra, whose name was Odaenathus. He fought on the side of Rome. He actually tried for a time to recover Valerian. He was a kind of surrogate for Rome in the east, as Gallienus was getting his feet under him. He was not successful at doing that, but he did aid Rome in the fight against the Sassanids, and was somewhat effective in that regard. Now, later on, right at the end of the reign of Gallienus, there's a couple-year period where things go really wrong for Rome. There are Gothic troops invading the Black Sea region, eventually into the Aegean, even sacking Athens at one point. And some of the Roman generals decide that Odaenathus is not their friend, and they assassinate him. And his wife, Zenobia, becomes the ruler of Palmyra. And at this point, obviously due to the assassination of Odaenathus, Zenobia turns against Rome, and Rome ends up fighting against Palmyra, and she tries to meddle for a time in the affairs of state, supporting one claimant to the throne over another. But ultimately, Zenobia was her troops were defeated, and Aurelian does this, and he defeats Palmyra and occupies the city, captures Zenobia, and actually marches her in the vanguard of a triumph through the city. But later on, it seems that he didn't have her executed, unlike what happened to some earlier rulers who had marched in Roman triumphs. He gave her a pension and a villa somewhere in Italy, and she lived out her life there. Like I said, Aurelian was actually pretty effective too, but he also was murdered, and the empire after the reign of Aurelian, after 275, just becomes incredibly chaotic. One emperor after another, one emperor succeeding another. Emperors constantly being assassinated, troops, raising emperors and then turning against them, and this is where we just don't need to get into the details. Suffice it to say that by 284, when Diocletian becomes emperor, Rome is on the point of collapse, and it takes somebody with the force of Diocletian to turn back the tide and to stabilize Rome, even though it came at a cost. And we'll talk about that cost in the next lecture. Thank you.